RedditHub. Baker then traveled to Cedar Rapids to dig through the Gazette's archives. He learned a few more things about Merle. She was 28 years old when she disappeared in 1926. If she had been Mary Doefor, she would have been born in 1897 to 1898. When she died in 1978, she would have been 80. The age matched Queenwood East's description of the woman they nursed for years. Merle taught in the small town of Maquoketa, about 60 miles east of Cedar Rapids, where she was last seen. She traveled every weekend from Maquoketa to her home in Mount Vernon and withdrew $10 from her bank account every week to pay for her train ticket. That week, on Thursday, a day before she went missing, she also withdrew those $10. If she worked in Maquoketa and her family's home was in Mount Vernon, it is unclear why she would be visiting Cedar Rapids, which sits 15 miles northwest of Mount Vernon. The Gazette also reported one rumor that could be key: police believed Merle was in poor health. She had even missed the first few weeks of the school year. There was no mention of what illness she suffered from, though. If the rumor that her doctor had his practice in Cedar Rapids was true, then her detour on Friday, November 5, 1926, would have been explainable. But did her illness or her doctor have anything to do with her disappearance? It was also in Cedar Rapids that Baker first got a glimpse of what Mary looked like around the time she went missing. The microfilm's photo quality was poor, but one could tell that she must have been an unusually attractive young woman with her piercing eyes, high cheekbones, and distinctive cleft chin. He tried to obtain a copy of the picture, but the Gazette didn't have it in their files anymore. And there was no way he could reprint the microfilm. So he made a mental note of everything he had heard about Mary's appearance in her youth and compared it to the murky, high-contrast picture he had before his eyes. Full face. Naturally curly hair. Harry had described Merle as blue-eyed with light brown hair. The old files he had unearthed from the Bartonville and Manteno hospitals also described young Mary as blue-eyed with light brown hair. The more evidence he dug up, the more he was convinced the two were the same person. On his way from Cedar Rapids back to Peoria, Baker made a quick stop in Davenport to dig through the Davenport Daily Times. By this time, he had gone through miles and miles of microfilm, yet he felt like he was still grasping at straws. Merle seemed to have dropped from the face of the earth. And Mary could only be accounted for in Manteno since 1932. If the two were the same woman, how had she managed to go under the radar for 6 years with no memory of who she was? In Davenport, he found an eyebrow-raising article published on November 20, 1926. It reported that 2 students from Cornell, Wendell Webb and Binford Arney, had set out to search for her in a desperate attempt to find her alive. Webb and Arney were 10 years younger than Merle and presumably knew her from class. According to the reporter, they had uncovered important clues but soon began to receive threatening letters and phone calls, urging them to drop the search, or they would turn up dead. Neither took such threats seriously, and the search continued. They were later urged by Cornell's president to give it up. They never spoke publicly about the clues they found. Another article caught Baker's eye. It identified another Cornell student as a person of interest. His name was George W. Penn, and he was a senior by the time Merle went missing. Penn was reported to have approached police with a major clue: Merle was pregnant when she disappeared. He knew it, and he offered to marry her, which she presumably declined. He was adamant, however, that he was not the baby's father. And he didn't know who it could be. Merle's family quickly rebuked Penn's statements, adding that a love affair and a child out of wedlock would have been incredibly out of character for her. Penn's statements could never be verified. Investigators searched hospitals in the Midwest for unidentified pregnant women but came up with nothing. Penn's account, too, was a dead end. 2 years later, the Davenport Times reported another exciting piece: a certain Dr. Jesse J. Cook and his wife had been arrested in 1928 following the death by sepsis of a young woman named Eva Thompson. Eva developed sepsis after a back-alley abortion performed by Cook. And there was more. Cook, who had his practice in Wheatland, was in Cedar Rapids the day Merle went missing, which led investigators to believe she might have been another victim of Cook's botched abortions. Coupled with Penn's statement and rumor that Merle went to Cedar Rapids to see a doctor and that she had been ill since the beginning of the school year, the puzzle pieces fit together. There was also an unconfirmed sighting of Merle in Wheatland a few days before her disappearance. Note that Cedar Rapids, Mount Vernon, and Wheatland are all along US Route 30, the highway that connects Cedar Rapids to Chicago, where Merle was supposedly seen wandering and where a mysterious man tried to pay for motel rooms for a sick woman. If Penn had been right and Merle was pregnant out of wedlock, and considering how ambitious and invested she was in her project to save up enough money to go back to Cornell to complete her education, she would likely seek an abortion. It's a plausible scenario. Merle finishes work on Friday, November 5th, uses the $10 she had withdrawn to buy a ticket from Maquoketa to Cedar Rapids, instead of Mount Vernon. In the suburb of Marion, she is seen by her friend getting off the train. She meets Dr. Cook, who attempts to perform an abortion on her, but it doesn't go well. He drives with her to his main practice in Wheatland. Once there, she either escapes herself or Cook decides that she's a liability and dumps her in the middle of nowhere, where onlookers reported seeing her. Myrtle is again seen wandering along US Route 30 by police, but they don't make contact because, at this point, they don't know a young woman is missing. She might have been trying to walk east to her family home in Mount Vernon or northwest to her home in Maquoketa. A driver approaches her and offers her a ride, but he ends up raping and beating her. Merle goes into shock and loses her memory from the trauma. At this point, her perpetrator is seen at various motels trying to book a hotel room for them both, explaining that she's very ill and/or having a nervous breakdown. He ends up driving west to Chicago, where he dumps her somewhere in the suburbs. An amnesic Myrtle is then found roaming the streets and ends up in a mental hospital, giving birth to the baby Cook failed to abort. This still doesn't account for the 6-year gap between her disappearance and her admission to a mental institution. Unfortunately, Dr. Cook never admitted to knowing Merle or performing an abortion on her. One can clearly guess why. But just because it made sense, it did nothing to prove Mary and Merle had been the same person. Baker planned his next move carefully. If only he could show the Queenwood East staff a picture of Merle, they could tell him whether or not this was the woman they cared for until her death in 1978. And there was only one person who could help him with that. Harry. Harry wasn't very pleased to see Baker turn up on his doorstep unannounced. Granted, it's not every day that a reporter drops by, asking for pictures of a sister you lost and mourned 5 decades prior, just because he thinks she might be a woman who lived a tragic life and died alone in a madhouse. Harry Sizer was in his 70s and had lived a stressful life as head of the town's bank. He had a weak heart. Actually, he would die later that year. When his sister went missing, he was only 20. He had seen how grief slowly consumed his parents in the years that followed, until they both went to their graves, never knowing what happened to their daughter. He had buried 2 of his brothers, Alexander and George, who never learned what happened to their sister either. He had decided on what he wanted to believe long ago: Merle had been murdered. Her death had been quick and painless. He couldn't conceive a different narrative, one where she lived a life of pain, unable to remember her own name, only 150 miles from where he lived. Baker, who was smart enough to withhold the most tragic details, compassionately explained to the old man why he was so sure the 2 women, Mary and Merle, could have been one and the same. But to prove it, he needed to show people who had known Mary what Merle had looked like. Harry declined at first, stating that he and his only surviving sister, Thamer, had talked and agreed that they would never accept this woman could be Merle. But he ended up giving Baker a portrait of his late sister. In Harry's picture, Merle is looking at something slightly off camera that seemed to amuse her, her eyes softened, and her lips drawn into a timid smile. Baker rushed back to Morton. At Queenwood East, an aide called Hilda Heron, who cared for Mary for 5 years, greets Baker at the door. It doesn't take long before Heron is shaking her head yes enthusiastically. Yes, this is the woman she had gotten to know so well. Baker shows it to a couple of other nurses, who all point out apparent similarities: the face shape, the curly hair, the sharp nose, the way her shoulders slope. Baker voices his regret that nobody bothered to take a picture of Mary while she was alive. But to his surprise, a secretary miraculously finds one in her records. In Mary's picture, one can see an old woman with short, curly gray hair. One side of her face drops because of a stroke she had. In Merle's picture, one can distinctly make out a vaccination scar on her left bicep. One of the nurses informs Baker that Mary, too, had a vaccination scar in the exact same place. She should never have been institutionalized, says one of them. She had amnesia, but she wasn't crazy. Had she not been put through what she was put through in Bartonville, she would have recovered her memory fast enough. Baker couldn't visit Bartonville to try and find a picture of younger Mary because it closed in 1973. His only option was Manteno State Hospital, where Mary had first turned up in 1932. But at Manteno, pictures were only kept 10 years, and no one in the staff could remember her. The archives weren't of much help either. A Mary Doe 4, the fourth Doe to turn up without a name, was listed as a black woman who was released into state custody in the 1940s. Mary was white, and she was never released. There were certain parallels between Mary Doe 5 and the woman who died in Morton, though. Her birth date was listed as June 7, 1907. It was the same estimated birth date Baker had seen on Queenwood East's death records. But this woman was said to come from Missouri. John Steinmetz, the superintendent who assisted Baker as he fumbled with the archives, was positive. This was a red herring. Manteno didn't keep serious records back in the day, and lots of information got mixed up when it came to the does. This wasn't exactly helpful. However, Baker obtained one key piece of information: Manteno had only opened in 1932. The year Mary was first accounted for. But chances are she had been hospitalized somewhere since 1926. Steinmetz thought there was a good chance Mary had been transferred there that year from Kankakee State Hospital. He called Kankakee and insisted that they dig through the transfer records from back in the day. A single, yellowing card was found. In neat handwriting, someone had written that an amnesic patient who couldn't remember her name had indeed been transferred from Kankakee to Bartonville, but it didn't say how long she had been in Kankakee. There was no record of her name because it was only when they arrived at Manteno that the Does were assigned their new names. Baker had an idea of what he would find, had he been allowed to see the Kankakee records. The woman had been there since November or December 1926, weeks after Merle went missing from Iowa. This could be the final piece in the puzzle that would allow him to write with total certainty that Mary and Merle were one and the same. But his phone call with Kankakee didn't go as expected. The secretary that picked up his call coldly informed him that she couldn't give him any information about their past patients without their consent. Baker tried to bargain with her. She didn't budge. The other people he called at a later date didn't budge either. Mary was dead. In that case, her family would have to sue the state government and convince a judge that they had a pretty good reason to dig through confidential medical records. Given the complexity of Mary's story, as well as Merle's family's interest in giving her a proper burial, the odds would have been in their favor. But Baker had to convince Harry Sizer of this before he could do anything else. Determined to come up with one last bit of evidence, Baker took Merle and Mary's portraits to Professor Charles Warren, an anthropologist known for his ability to match pictures of people to their skeletal remains. Baker had hopes that Warren could positively identify Mary as Merle from their face shapes. Warren would have needed an X-ray of Mary's skull to come up with a final verdict, but since Mary had been cremated, all he had to work with was her picture from Queenwood East. He studied the two portraits side by side for several long minutes. This kind of identification process didn't exactly match his skill set, so there was no way it could be used to legally prove the pictures were of the same woman. But Baker's story had moved him, so he decided to weigh in with his opinion for what it was worth. After a while, he rested his elbows on his desk, took his glasses off, rubbed his nose, and faced Baker. He pointed out the women's chins. Both had cleft chins, even if Mary's didn't appear so obvious. That was because she was pushing her mandible forward to hide her missing teeth. The older woman's skin had sagged, and the stroke made one side of her face drop, but their bone structure was strikingly similar. The placement of the cheekbones was virtually the same. The hair texture was identical. So were they the same woman? Warren smiled sadly at Baker. His eyes said yes, but his mouth said there was no way he could prove it. Baker made one last attempt to convince Harry Sizer that Mary was his long-lost sister. No DNA could be tested, but if they were able to get a hold of the Kankakee records, they would have the closest thing resembling the final puzzle piece, proof that Mary had been at Kankakee from 1926 through 1932 when she was transferred to Bartonville. The Peoria Journal-Star, impressed with Baker's stellar detective work, was ready to help Harry Sizer in court. One of the newspaper's reporters, a licensed attorney, was willing to represent him free of charge. Baker would cover the story and claim justice of Merle, a victim of the system's barbaric mental health care system. Merle's ashes would finally be transferred into a proper urn Harry's family could keep. She would have a service and a gravestone with her real name and birth date. People who knew her and who were still alive could say their last goodbyes. But Harry was having none of it. His sister's disappearance had been the most painful thing his family had been through. Without a grave for him to place flowers at and an explanation to give him that much-needed closure, he had had to mourn her in his own way. He had had to bury her himself, in the very depths of his heart, with no flowers but the secret hope that Merle had crossed the bridge smoothly into a place beyond ache and injury. It took Baker several minutes to process what he had just been told. And even longer for him to reach into his jacket pocket and hand back Anne Merle Sizer's haunting portrait. Endnotes: Rick Baker could never prove that Mary Dufour and Anna Merle Sizer were the same person. Harry Sizer died on July 18, 1979, in his home in Lisbon, Iowa, 4 months after Rick Baker published the last chapter of his investigation on Mary Dufour on the Peoria Journal-Star. Anna Merle Sizer's last living sister, Thamer Sizer, died on February 5, 1988, in Iowa. Rick Baker reached out to her too, but she never sued the state to gain access to Mary Dufour's Kankakee records either. Baker searched for the child Mary Dufour gave birth to, presumably at Kankakee, but he couldn't find a record. The urn containing Mary Dufour's ashes were buried under a fir tree at Roberts Cemetery in Morton, Illinois, in a space reserved for people with no money and no relatives. Her grave reads simply, Mary Dufour, June 7, 1907 to March 2, 1978.